In a world where first impressions can make or break careers, where assumptions run deeper than ocean trenches, and where the most powerful stories are written not in ink on paper, but in the scars and symbols we carry on our skin, one woman's journey would challenge everything the military thought they knew about strength, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. What happens when the very thing that makes you an outcast becomes the key to your greatest triumph? When the mockery of others transforms into the deepest respect. When hidden beneath the surface of what others see as weakness lies a strength so profound it commands the attention of the most elite warriors in the world. This is not just a story about tattoos. This is not just a story about military training. This is the story of Maria Santos, a woman whose skin told a story that would silence her critics, humble her superiors, and forever change how one of the most prestigious military units in the world views the warriors among them. Some stories are written in blood. Some are carved in stone. But the most powerful stories of all are the ones written in the language of survival, courage, and love that runs deeper than skin. This is one of those stories. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete of the Naval Training Center as Maria Santos stood in formation with 47 other recruits. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation style. Her uniform pressed to perfection, but it was the flash of color visible beneath her rolled sleeves that caught the attention of drill instructor Peterson. Santos, his voice boomed across the courtyard like a cannon blast. Front and center now. Maria's heart hammered as she stepped forward, her boots clicking against the hot pavement. She had known this moment would come. Ever since she had rolled up her sleeves during the morning inspection, she had felt the stares, heard the whispered comments from her fellow recruits. The intricate design that wrapped around her left forearm was impossible to hide completely, and she had foolishly hoped it might go unnoticed for just a few more days. "What is that artwork on your arm, recruit?" Peterson's voice dripped with disdain as he circled her like a predator sizing up its prey. His weathered face, marked by decades of service and countless deployments, showed nothing but contempt as his eyes fixed on the colorful ink that decorated Maria's skin. "It's a tattoo, sir," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. She had practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times during the weeks leading up to boot camp, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of Peterson's glare or the snickering she could hear from the other recruits behind her. "I can see that, Santos. What I want to know is why you thought it was appropriate to turn your body into a coloring book before enlisting in the United States Navy." Peterson stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the network of small scars that crisscrossed his hands. "Did you think this was some kind of summer camp where we hand out participation trophies for creative expression?" The laughter from her fellow recruits was no longer concealed. Maria could hear Jenkins, a tall recruit from Texas, barely containing his amusement. Williams, the college graduate from New York who had made it clear he considered himself superior to most of the other recruits, wasn't even trying to hide his smirk. Morrison, the former high school football star who had been struggling with the physical demands of training, seemed grateful for any opportunity to deflect attention from his own shortcomings. "No, sir," Maria replied, maintaining her stance at attention even as her cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I understand this is serious training, sir." Peterson's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Serious training? Santos, do you have any idea what we do here? We build warriors. We forge weapons out of raw human material. We create sailors who will sail into harm's way to protect this nation." He gestured dismissively at her arm. "And you show up looking like you just walked out a circus sideshow." The drill instructor began to pace again, his voice rising so that every recruit in the formation could hear clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Recruit Santos, who apparently believes that military service is compatible with turning herself into a walking piece of graffiti. Perhaps she thinks the enemy will be so distracted by her pretty pictures that they'll forget to shoot." More laughter rippled through the formation. Maria kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, staring at a point on the wall of the barracks beyond Peterson's shoulder. She had learned early in her 22 years that showing weakness only invited more attacks, and she was determined not to give these people any more ammunition than they already had. But Peterson wasn't finished. Tell us, Santos, what inspired this particular piece of body art? Did you lose a bet? Were you drunk? Or did you just wake up one morning and decide that the United States Navy needed more recruits who looked like they belonged in a biker gang? It has personal meaning, sir, Maria managed to say, though her voice was beginning to crack under the pressure of the sustained humiliation. Personal meaning. Peterson's voice reached a new level of mockery. Well, isn't that touching? And I'm sure when you're crawling through the mud under enemy fire, that personal meaning will be very comforting. I'm sure when you're trying to blend in during reconnaissance missions, that colorful display will be exactly what the situation calls for. The drill instructor turned to address the entire formation, using Maria as a living example of what not to do. Take a good look, recruits. This is what happens when people confuse self-expression with military readiness. This is what happens when someone thinks their personal feelings matter more than the standards and traditions of the United States Navy. Behind her, Maria could hear Williams muttering to Jenkins about how some people just weren't cut out for military service. Morrison was making jokes about tattoo removal being covered by military health care. Even some of the female recruits were joining in the mockery, apparently eager to distance themselves from Maria's perceived failure to meet military standards. Santos, Peterson continued, his voice now carrying a tone of weary disappointment. I want you to understand something very clearly. In 8 weeks, some of these recruits will graduate and go on to serve their country with honor. Some will wash out because they lack the physical strength or mental toughness required for naval service. And some, he paused dramatically, will wash out because they never understood what it means to put the needs of their country above their own personal desires. The words hit Maria like physical blows. She had dreamed of military service since she was a child, had spent years preparing physically and mentally for this opportunity. Her father had served in the Marines during the Gulf War, and her grandfather had been a Navy corpsman in Vietnam. Military service wasn't just a career choice for her. It was a calling, a chance to honor the legacy of sacrifice that ran through her family's blood. But now, standing in front of 47 other recruits while being publicly humiliated for something that represented the deepest parts of her soul, Maria began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. The tattoo on her arm wasn't just decoration, as Peterson and the others assumed. It wasn't the result of a drunken night or a rebellious phase. It was a memorial, a tribute, a permanent reminder of the most important person in her life. I expect this kind of poor judgment to manifest itself in other ways during your training, Santos, Peterson said, his voice now returning to its normal commanding tone. I expect you to struggle with discipline, with following orders, with understanding that in the military, there is no room for individualism or personal expression. The enemy doesn't care about your feelings or your art. They care about killing you and your fellow sailors. As Peterson dismissed her back to formation, Maria felt the weight of 47 pairs of eyes on her back. She could practically feel the judgment radiating from her fellow recruits, could sense their relief that they weren't the ones being singled out for public humiliation. Some were probably already planning to request different bunkmates, not wanting to be associated with a recruit who had so spectacularly failed to meet military standards. The rest of the morning's training passed in a blur of push-ups, running, and classroom instruction, but Maria could feel the invisible barrier that had been erected between her and the other recruits. During breaks, conversations stopped when she approached. During meals, chairs remained conspicuously empty on either side of wherever she chose to sit. During evening free time, study groups formed that somehow never seemed to include her. Jenkins, the tall Texan, made his feelings clear during their first evening in the barracks. Nothing personal, Santos, he said while cleaning his gear, but I don't want to be associated with someone who's obviously not serious about being here. This isn't the place for rebels or artists. This is the military. Williams was less diplomatic. "I don't understand why they even let people like you enlist," he said while folding his uniforms with precision that would have impressed a professional dry cleaner. The whole point of military service is uniformity, discipline, following rules. The thing on your arm shows you don't respect any of that. Even Rodriguez, one of the few other Hispanic recruits in their company, kept his distance. "Look, I'm not judging you," he said quietly one evening, "but I worked too hard to get here to have my reputation damaged by association with someone who's going to wash out anyway." The physical training was demanding, but Maria found herself actually looking forward to the exhausting runs, the endless push-ups, the obstacle courses that left her muscles screaming and her lungs burning. Physical pain was simple, straightforward, honest. It demanded nothing more than endurance and determination, qualities she possessed in abundance. The real challenge was the psychological warfare of isolation and contempt that surrounded her every waking moment. During weapons training, when recruits were paired up for buddy exercises, Maria consistently found herself without a partner until instructors forced someone to work with her. During navigation exercises, team leaders somehow forgot to include her in their planning sessions. During survival training, she discovered that her assigned tent mate had mysteriously developed a preference for sleeping outdoors. The drill instructors seemed to take particular pleasure in using her as an example of military failure. Sergeant Coleman, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, never missed an opportunity to point out how her lack of respect for military standards was probably connected to any mistake she made during training. "Santos moves like she's carrying the weight of all that ink," Coleman would bellow when she struggled with a particularly challenging obstacle. Maybe if she spent less time in tattoo parlors and more time in the gym, she'd be able to keep up with real sailors. Even when she performed well, which was increasingly often as the weeks progressed, the instructors found ways to minimize her achievements. When she finished first in a 5-mile run, Peterson attributed it to probably wanting to get back to the barracks quickly to admire her artwork in the mirror. When she scored highest on a written examination about naval history, Coleman suggested that book learning doesn't translate to real-world performance when you're more concerned with personal expression than military excellence. The psychological pressure was relentless. Every morning brought new challenges, new opportunities for public humiliation, new reminders that she was considered unworthy of wearing the same uniform as her fellow recruits. Maria began to question everything about herself, everything about her decision to enlist, everything about her worthiness to serve her country. But late at night, when the barracks were quiet and her fellow recruits were sleeping, Maria would look at the tattoo on her arm and remember why she was really there. The intricate design wasn't just ink and color. It wasn't rebellion or self-expression or artistic vanity. It was love, loss, sacrifice, and promise all rolled into one permanent reminder of what truly mattered. She would think about the person who had inspired the tattoo, about the promises she had made, about the legacy she was determined to honor regardless of what Peterson or Coleman or any of the other recruits thought about her. She would remember that strength isn't always visible on the surface, that the most important battles are often fought in silence, and that the people who mock what they don't understand are usually the ones who understand the least about what real courage looks like. Week 4 of boot camp arrived like a storm front, bringing with it the most challenging phase of training that would separate those truly committed to military service from those who had simply thought it might be an interesting experience. The physical demands increased dramatically, the academic requirements became more complex, and the psychological pressure reached levels that sent several recruits home with medical discharges. For Maria Santos, Week 4 brought something even more challenging than the increased training demands. It brought the moment when the mockery and isolation finally pushed her past her breaking point. The incident began during what should have been a routine equipment inspection. Each recruit was required to lay out their gear in precise formations, with every item clean, functional, and positioned according to strict regulations. Maria had spent 2 hours the previous evening ensuring that every buckle gleamed, every surface was spotless, Every measurement was exact. But when drill instructor Peterson approached her station, his expression immediately shifted to one of disgusted disappointment. Santos, what is this disaster supposed to represent? Maria's heart sank as she looked at her carefully arranged gear. Everything appeared perfect to her eyes, but she had learned that Peterson could find fault with arrangements that seemed flawless to everyone else. My gear lay out for inspection, sir. Peterson picked up her canteen and held it up to the light, searching for some microscopic flaw. Finding none, he set it down with exaggerated force and moved to her rifle. The weapon was immaculate, cleaned, and oiled according to the detailed procedures they had spent days learning. Still, Peterson shook his head as if confronted by evidence of criminal negligence. The problem, Santos, isn't with your equipment, Peterson announced loud enough for the entire platoon to hear. The problem is with the person responsible for maintaining it. How can I trust someone to properly care for the weapons and gear that might save lives in combat when that same person showed such poor judgment in permanently defacing her own body? The familiar script was beginning again, but this time something felt different to Maria. Perhaps it was the exhaustion from 4 weeks of constant stress. Or perhaps it was the growing realization that no matter how perfectly she performed, she would never escape the shadow of Peterson's prejudice. Sir, with respect, my tattoo has no bearing on my ability to maintain my equipment or perform my duties, Maria heard herself saying before she could stop the words from coming out. The barracks went dead silent. Somewhere in the distance, a flag snapped in the wind, but inside the long building where 48 recruits stood at attention, the only sound was the collective intake of breath from people who knew they were witnessing something that would have serious consequences. Peterson's face slowly turned red, the colors starting at his collar and creeping upward until his entire head seemed to glow with fury. Excuse me, recruit? Did you just question my judgment? Maria's mind raced. She knew she was standing at the edge of a cliff, knew that her next words could end her military career before it had even begun. But something deep inside her, something that had been building pressure for 4 weeks of constant humiliation, finally demanded to be heard. No, sir, I'm not questioning your judgment about military matters. But I'm saying that my tattoo is being used to judge my character and abilities in ways that have nothing to do with my performance as a sailor. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Behind her, Maria could hear Williams muttering something about finally showing her true colors, and Jenkins saying something about disrespect for authority. But she could also hear a few recruits shifting uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that she had finally voiced something that some of them had been thinking. Peterson stepped closer, close enough that Maria could see the individual stubble hairs on his jaw and the small scar above his left eyebrow. Santos, you have just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic excuse for a military career. You think because you can run fast and score well on tests that you understand what military service is about? You think your personal feelings about fairness matter in a world where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death. I think that military service should be judged on performance, dedication, and commitment to the mission, sir, Maria replied, knowing she was digging herself deeper, but unable to stop. I think that dismissing someone's capabilities based on their appearance undermines the very principles we're supposed to be learning about teamwork and mutual respect. The explosion that followed was unlike anything the recruits had witnessed during their time at boot camp. Peterson's voice reached decibel levels that seemed physically impossible, his words coming so fast and furious that they blended together into a continuous assault of criticism, threats, and predictions of failure. You think you're defending principles, Santos? You think you're standing up for some noble cause? Let me tell you what you're really doing. You're demonstrating exactly why people with your attitude don't belong in military service. You're showing every person in this platoon that when the pressure gets high, when the stakes get real, you'll put your personal feelings ahead of discipline and respect for authority. Peterson began to pace, his voice carrying to every corner of the barracks. In combat, Santos, there is no room for debate. There is no time for philosophical discussions about fairness. There are only orders that must be followed instantly and completely because hesitation gets people killed. And you have just proven that when you disagree with an order or feel like you're being treated unfairly, you'll waste precious time arguing instead of acting. The drill instructor stopped directly in front of Maria again, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You want to know what I think about your tattoo, recruit? I think it represents everything that's wrong with your generation. I think it shows that you're more concerned with making personal statements than with serving something larger than yourself. I think it proves that you lack the selflessness and humility required for military service. Behind Peterson, Maria could see the faces of her fellow recruits. Some looked embarrassed for her, some looked angry at her for disrupting their training, and some looked eager to see how much deeper she would dig herself into trouble. But a few, she noticed, looked troubled, as if they were beginning to question whether the constant mockery had gone too far. And now, Peterson continued, you've confirmed my assessment by showing that you'll challenge authority when you feel like you're not being treated fairly. Well, let me share a secret with you, Santos. Military life isn't fair. Combat isn't fair. War isn't fair. And if you can't handle having your personal choices criticized during peacetime training, you'll never survive the real challenges that military service demands. Maria felt tears starting to form at the corners of her eyes, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with Peterson. She had come this far, had endured 4 weeks of constant humiliation and isolation. If she was going to be thrown out of boot camp, she was determined to leave with her dignity intact. Sir, I understand that military life involves sacrifice and that fairness isn't guaranteed. But I also believe that good military leaders judge their people based on their actions and capabilities, not on assumptions about their character based on their appearance. The second explosion was even more intense than the first. Peterson's voice reached levels that seemed to make the windows vibrate, and his predictions of Maria's inevitable failure became increasingly creative and detailed. He described scenarios where her lack of discipline and respect would get fellow sailors killed, situations where her inability to follow orders without argument would compromise military operations, and futures where her selfish attitude would dishonor every person who had ever worn a military uniform. But even as Peterson's verbal assault continued, something interesting began to happen among the other recruits. Williams and Jenkins were nodding along with every criticism, clearly believing that Maria was getting exactly what she deserved. But Rodriguez was looking uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as if he wanted to say something, but didn't dare. Morrison was staring at the floor, apparently lost in thought. And Thompson, one of the quieter female recruits, was watching Maria with what looked like growing respect rather than disapproval. The tirade continued for another 10 minutes, with Peterson covering every possible aspect of Maria's presumed character flaws and future failures. He questioned her commitment, her intelligence, her patriotism, and her worthiness to wear the same uniform as real sailors. He suggested that her parents should be ashamed of raising such a selfish and disrespectful daughter, and wondered aloud whether people with her attitude should be allowed to serve in any capacity. Finally, when Peterson seemed to have exhausted his vocabulary of criticism and contempt, he delivered what he clearly intended to be the final blow. Santos, you're confined to barracks for the remainder of the week. You will spend your free time writing a 5,000-word essay about the importance of respect for authority in military service. You will clean the bathrooms every morning before reveille and every evening after lights out. And you will report to my office every day at noon for additional counseling about your attitude problem. Peterson paused, clearly expecting Maria to break down, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, and promise to never question his judgment again. The silence stretched out until it became uncomfortable, with every person in the barracks waiting to see how this confrontation would finally end. Instead of breaking down, Maria straightened her shoulders and looked Peterson directly in the eye. "Yes, sir. Is there anything else, sir?" The simple response seemed to catch Peterson off guard. He had clearly expected tears, apologies, or further argument. Instead, he was faced with a recruit who appeared to be accepting his punishment with quiet dignity, which somehow made his victory feel less complete than he had anticipated. "Dismissed," he finally said, but his voice lacked the satisfaction that should have accompanied his total domination of the confrontation. As the other recruits filed out of the barracks for their next training session, Maria remained behind to begin her punishment duties. She could hear whispered conversations starting up as soon as the group was out of Peterson's earshot, and she knew that her confrontation with the drill instructor would be the primary topic of conversation for days to come. But as she gathered the cleaning supplies and headed toward the bathroom facilities, Maria felt something unexpected. Despite the punishment, despite the continued isolation, despite the certainty that her life at boot camp had just become significantly more difficult, she felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in 4 weeks, she had spoken her truth. For the first time since arriving at boot camp, she had stood up for herself and her beliefs. And while she knew the consequences would be severe, she also knew that she had finally stopped pretending that silence and submission would eventually earn her acceptance. As she began scrubbing toilets in preparation for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging weeks of her military career, Maria thought about the tattoo on her arm and the person it represented. She thought about courage, about standing up for what's right even when the cost is high, and about the difference between earning respect and simply demanding it. The confrontation with Peterson had changed everything, but as Maria worked through her punishment duties, she began to realize that the change might not be entirely negative. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important battles are the ones that look like defeats from the outside, but feel like victories on the inside. The emergency that would change everything began at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning in week 6 of boot camp, when the piercing wail of alarm sirens shattered the pre-dawn quiet of the Naval Training Center. Maria jolted awake in her bottom bunk, instantly alert despite having been in deep sleep just moments before. Around her, 47 other recruits stumbled through the confusion of sudden awakening, grabbing for uniforms and equipment in the darkness. "This is not a drill." Drill instructor Coleman's voice boomed through the barracks loudspeaker system. "All personnel report to emergency stations immediately. Medical emergency in progress." Maria's training kicked in automatically. Despite the weeks of isolation and punishment duties that had become her routine since the confrontation with Peterson, muscle memory took over. She was dressed and ready in under 3 minutes, her medical training pack secured, and her equipment checked with the efficiency that had become second nature. The emergency was unlike anything the recruits had experienced during their training. A massive multi-vehicle accident had occurred just outside the base perimeter, involving a charter bus carrying 38 elderly passengers returning from a casino trip, 2 commercial trucks, and several civilian vehicles. The scale of the disaster had overwhelmed the immediate response capabilities of local emergency services, and the base commander had authorized the deployment of all available personnel to assist with rescue and medical operations. As the recruits assembled in formation outside the barracks, Maria could see the orange glow of fires reflected against the low-hanging clouds and hear the distant wail of ambulance sirens. The accident site was less than 2 miles away, and even at that distance, the scope of the emergency was becoming clear. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, the base medical officer, took charge of organizing the recruit response. A tall woman with graying hair and steady hands that spoke of decades of emergency medical experience, she quickly began assessing the skills and capabilities of the available personnel. "I need everyone with advanced medical training to identify themselves immediately," she called out, her voice cutting through the pre-dawn chaos with practiced authority. EMT certification, paramedic training, nursing experience, military medical corps background. Time is critical, people. Several hands went up immediately. Williams had EMT training from his college years. Rodriguez had worked as a volunteer firefighter before enlisting. Thompson had completed nursing school before deciding to pursue military service. Maria raised her hand as well, though she knew that her current status as a problem recruit might eliminate her from consideration. Commander Mitchell worked her way down the line quickly, asking brief questions about training, experience, and certifications. When she reached Maria, her tired eyes showed no recognition of the recruit's disciplinary problems or reputation for attitude issues. In an emergency, competence was the only qualification that mattered. "What's your medical background, Santos?" Mitchell asked, consulting the clipboard that listed the recruits by name and specialization. Certified paramedic, MAM. 3 years experience with Metro Emergency Services before enlisting. Trauma certification, pediatric advanced life support, hazardous materials training. Maria's response was crisp and professional, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty that had characterized her recent interactions with military authority. Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly. Paramedic certification was significantly more advanced than the basic medical training most of the recruits possessed, and 3 years of urban emergency medical service represented substantial real-world experience. Any specializations? Combat trauma training through Civilian Emergency Response Partnership with Marine Corps Medical Training Program, ma'am. Advanced Airway Management Certification. Crisis Intervention and Family Notification Training. Maria's qualifications continued to surprise the medical officer, who was clearly reconsidering her initial assessment of the young recruit. Within minutes, Maria found herself assigned to Alpha Medical Team, the advanced response unit that will be first on the scene to assess and stabilize the most critically injured victims. The team included Commander Mitchell herself, 2 Navy medical technicians with combat experience, and 3 civilians with advanced medical training who lived on base housing. It was an assignment typically reserved for the most experienced and trusted personnel. As they loaded into the emergency response vehicles, Maria caught sight of Peterson and Coleman watching the deployment with expressions of obvious displeasure. She knew they were unhappy about her inclusion in the advanced response team, but emergency protocols had temporarily superseded the normal chain of command and disciplinary considerations. The scene that greeted Alpha Medical Team at the accident site was unlike anything Maria had encountered during her civilian emergency medical service career. The charter bus had rolled 3 times before coming to rest on its side in a drainage ditch, its windows shattered, and its frame twisted into a configuration that made passenger extraction extremely difficult. One of the commercial trucks had jackknifed across 2 lanes of highway, its trailer contents scattered across hundreds of yards of roadway. Smaller vehicles were crushed, overturned, or burning, creating a maze of twisted metal and human suffering that challenged even the most experienced first responders. Commander Mitchell quickly established a triage area and began coordinating with civilian emergency services, but it was immediately clear that the medical demands of the situation far exceeded the available resources. The nearest trauma center was 45 minutes away by ambulance, but several victims required immediate intervention that couldn't wait for transport. "Santos," Mitchell called out as she surveyed the chaos, "I need you to take charge of the critical airway management station. We've got 3 victims with compromised breathing, and I need someone with advanced training to handle the intubations while I coordinate the overall medical response." It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, life-or-death situation that Maria had trained for during her civilian career, but doing it as a military recruit who had spent weeks being treated as a discipline problem added an extra layer of pressure. As she set up her equipment and prepared to work on victims whose lives hung in the balance, she was acutely aware that her performance would be observed and evaluated by people who had already formed strong opinions about her character and capabilities. The first patient was an elderly man who had been thrown from the bus during the rollover. His airway was blocked by blood and debris, his breathing was labored and irregular, and his pulse was weak and thready. Under normal circumstances, establishing an advanced airway in such a patient would be challenging even in a hospital setting. On the side of a highway, in the dark, with limited equipment, and the chaos of a major accident surrounding them. It represented one of the most difficult procedures in emergency medicine. Maria worked with the calm efficiency that had been drilled into her during thousands of hours of training and real-world experience. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she cleared the airway, positioned the patient, and prepared her intubation equipment. Around her, she could hear the sounds of the broader rescue operation, but her focus narrowed to the immediate task of saving the life of the person in front of her. The intubation was successful on the first attempt, a feat that drew appreciative nods from the Navy medical technicians who were assisting with other patients. But Maria barely noticed the approval as she moved on to establishing intravenous access and beginning the process of stabilizing the patient for transport. The second patient was even more challenging. A middle-aged woman had suffered massive facial trauma that made conventional intubation nearly impossible. Maria had to perform an emergency surgical airway procedure, using techniques she had learned during her combat trauma training, but had never had to use in a real emergency situation. Working by flashlight with improvised instruments, Maria made the precise incisions needed to create an artificial airway below the area of facial trauma. It was delicate work that required steady hands and absolute confidence, because any mistake could prove fatal for a patient who was already clinging to life. As she worked, Maria became aware that her actions were being closely observed not just by the medical personnel on scene, but by several of her fellow recruits who were assisting with less critical tasks. Williams was helping to carry supplies, and she could see him watching her work with expressions that seemed to shift between surprise and grudging respect. Rodriguez was assisting with patient evacuation, but she caught him glancing in her direction repeatedly as she performed procedures that were clearly beyond his level of training. Even more significantly, she noticed that Commander Mitchell was taking careful note of her performance. The senior medical officer was moving between different treatment areas, but she consistently returned to check on Maria's patients and observe her techniques. And her observations seemed to be generating a level of professional respect that was markedly different from the disciplinary attitude Maria had grown accustomed to from military authority figures. The third critical patient presented yet another set of challenges. A teenage boy who had been a passenger in one of the civilian vehicles had suffered a tension pneumothorax, a condition where air trapped in the chest cavity was preventing his lungs from expanding and his heart from pumping effectively. Without immediate intervention, he would die within minutes. The treatment required performing a needle decompression, a procedure that involved inserting a large bore needle between the ribs to release the trapped air. It was a technique that could save lives when performed correctly, but could be fatal if done improperly. Under the circumstances, with limited lighting and equipment, it represented another high-stakes test of Maria's abilities. Maria positioned herself carefully and palpated the boy's chest to identify the correct anatomical landmarks. She could feel his heart racing beneath her hands, could see the growing cyanosis around his lips that indicated his condition was deteriorating rapidly. There was no time for hesitation, no opportunity for second-guessing. The needle insertion was perfect, and the immediate rush of air that followed confirmed that she had successfully relieved the life-threatening pressure in the boy's chest. His breathing immediately became easier, his color began to improve, and his heart rate stabilized. Within minutes, he was conscious and talking, asking about his family members who had been in the car with him. It was at that moment, as Maria was monitoring the teenager's vital signs and preparing him for transport to the trauma center, that she noticed drill instructor Peterson standing at the edge of the treatment area. He had been watching her work for several minutes, and his expression was unlike anything she had seen from him during the previous 6 weeks of training. Peterson approached Commander Mitchell, and Maria could hear fragments of their conversation over the noise of the ongoing rescue operation. She caught words like exceptional performance, advanced capabilities, and completely reassessing. The tone of Peterson's voice was respectful, almost deferential, as he discussed Maria's actions with the senior medical officer. As the most critical patients were loaded into ambulances for transport to area hospitals, Commander Mitchell called Maria aside for what appeared to be an immediate after-action evaluation. Maria expected to be debriefed about her medical procedures and perhaps questioned about specific decisions she had made during the emergency response. Instead, Mitchell's first question caught her completely off guard. "Santos, why didn't anyone tell me about your medical background when I was forming the initial response teams? Paramedic certification with trauma specialization and 3 years of urban emergency experience should have put you at the top of my list from the beginning." Maria wasn't sure how to respond. The honest answer was that her medical qualifications had been completely overshadowed by the ongoing disciplinary issues and attitude problems that had defined her boot camp experience. But she sensed that Commander Mitchell was asking about something deeper than just administrative oversight. "I'm not sure, ma'am. My focus has been on meeting the basic requirements of boot camp training, and I suppose my previous experience hasn't come up in the normal course of instruction." Mitchell studied Maria's face in the glow of the emergency lighting. "Santos, I've been doing emergency medicine for 22 years, including 4 combat deployments and more civilian disaster responses than I can count. What I just watched you do out here represents the kind of clinical skill and decision-making that I expect from senior medical personnel with years of military experience. You performed 3 advanced procedures flawlessly under conditions that would challenge physicians, and you did it with a level of calm professionalism that suggests this isn't your first major emergency." The praise was so unexpected and so different from any feedback Maria had received during boot camp that she wasn't sure how to respond. For weeks, she had been told that she lacked the character, discipline, and judgment required for military service. Now she was being praised by a senior officer for exactly the kinds of qualities that had supposedly been missing from her personality. "Thank you, ma'am. I was glad to be able to help." Mitchell's expression grew more serious. "Santos, I'm going to be writing a detailed report about tonight's emergency response, and your performance is going to figure prominently in that report. But before I do that, I want to understand something. Why is someone with your level of medical training and real-world experience currently on disciplinary status for attitude problems?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Maria knew that her answer could significantly influence how the emergency response was documented and how her role in it would be perceived by the command structure. But she also knew that Commander Mitchell was asking for honesty, not diplomacy. "Ma'am, I believe there have been some assumptions made about my character and attitude based on my appearance rather than my performance. I've tried to meet all training standards and requirements, but I've been judged primarily on the basis of having a tattoo rather than on my actions as a recruit." Mitchell nodded slowly, as if Maria's answer confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. "Santos, tomorrow morning you're going to report to my office at 0800 hours. We're going to have a detailed conversation about your background, your career goals, and your potential for military medical service. Tonight's emergency has raised some questions that I believe need to be addressed at a level considerably above the standard boot camp disciplinary process." The knock on Commander Mitchell's office door at precisely 0800 hours the following morning marked the beginning of a conversation that would change not only Maria's military career, but also the way the Naval Training Center approached the evaluation of recruit potential. Maria had spent the sleepless hours since the emergency response replaying every moment of her medical interventions and trying to prepare for what she assumed would be a detailed technical debriefing. Instead, she found herself facing a woman whose interests seemed to extend far beyond the medical procedures she had performed during the highway accident. Commander Mitchell's office was different from the sterile administrative spaces that dominated most of the training facility. Personal photographs showed her in various deployment locations around the world. Medical commendations covered one wall, and medical textbooks shared shelf space with what appeared to be personal journals and family photos. "Sit down, Santos," Mitchell said, gesturing to a comfortable chair that was positioned across from her desk rather than in the formal interview configuration that Maria had expected. "Before we discuss last night's emergency, I want to understand who you really are and why you're here." The invitation to speak freely was so unexpected that Maria wasn't sure how to respond. For 6 weeks, her interactions with authority figures have been characterized by rigid protocols, formal military courtesy, and the constant threat of disciplinary action. The opportunity for genuine conversation felt almost foreign. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am. I'm here to serve my country and hopefully begin a career in military medical service." Mitchell leaned back in her chair and studied Maria's face with the kind of professional assessment that suggested she was accustomed to reading people under stress. "Santos, I reviewed your file this morning, and I've also had some interesting conversations with your drill instructors. What I'm seeing is a disconnect between your documented capabilities and your current status that doesn't make sense." The commander picked up a folder from her desk and opened it to reveal what appeared to be Maria's complete military and civilian records. "Your civilian emergency medical service record shows 3 years of exemplary performance, including commendations for bravery under fire during 2 separate mass casualty incidents. Your paramedic training scores were in the top 5% of your class. Your college academic record shows a 3.8 GPA in pre-medical studies before you decided to pursue emergency medical services." Mitchell paused and looked up from the file. "Your military entrance examination scores were exceptional across all categories. Your physical fitness standards are among the highest in your bootcamp class. Your written examinations during military training have been consistently above average, and your practical skills demonstrations have been flawless." The commander closed the file and leaned forward slightly. "So explain to me, Santos, why someone with your background and performance record is currently considered a disciplinary problem with attitude issues that may prevent successful completion of basic military training." Maria felt a familiar tightness in her chest that she had learned to associate with discussions about her perceived character flaws and military unsuitability. But something in Commander Mitchell's tone suggested that this conversation might be different from the accusations and predetermined conclusions she had grown accustomed to. "Ma'am, I believe the primary issue has been my tattoo and the assumptions that have been made about my character based on my appearance." "Tell me about the tattoo, Santos. Help me understand what it represents and why it's become such a significant factor in how you're perceived." For a moment, Maria hesitated. The story behind her tattoo was deeply personal, painful, and not something she had shared with anyone during her military training. But something in Commander Mitchell's expression suggested that this might be the moment for complete honesty. "The tattoo is a memorial, ma'am. It's a tribute to my younger brother, Danny, who died in Afghanistan 3 years ago." Mitchell's expression immediately shifted to one of serious attention. "Your brother was military?" "Yes, ma'am. Marine Corps Infanterie. He was killed by an improvised explosive device during his second deployment. He was 19 years old." Maria's voice remained steady, but Commander Mitchell could see the effort it required to maintain her composure. "The tattoo depicts scenes from his childhood and our family's heritage. It includes imagery from the neighborhood where we grew up, symbols representing his love of baseball, and music, and text in Spanish that includes his favorite Bible verse and a promise I made to him before his final deployment." Maria paused and took a breath before continuing. "I promised Danny that I would follow his example of service to our country and that I would never forget the values he died defending. The tattoo is my way of carrying that promise with me every day." Commander Mitchell was quiet for several moments, processing not just the information about Maria's tattoo, but also the broader implications of how that information might change the evaluation of her military potential. "Santos, are you telling me that for the past 6 weeks, you've been subjected to discipline and criticism for wearing a memorial to a fallen Marine?" "That's correct, ma'am, although the circumstances behind the tattoo haven't come up in previous discussions. The focus has been on the tattoo as evidence of poor judgment and lack of respect for military standards." Mitchell stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the training grounds where dozens of new recruits were beginning their morning physical training. Santos, I need you to help me understand something. If your brother was a Marine who died in service to his country, and if your tattoo is a memorial to his sacrifice, why hasn't this information been part of your military record? I didn't think it was relevant, ma'am. Military service should be judged on performance and capability, not on personal tragedy or family connections. I wanted to earn my place based on my own merit. The response seemed to surprise Commander Mitchell, who turned back to face Maria with an expression of growing respect. You spent 6 weeks being criticized and disciplined for something that actually represents the deepest kind of military honor and family sacrifice, and you never used your brother's service record to defend yourself? No, ma'am. Danny's sacrifice shouldn't be used to excuse any shortcomings in my own performance or character. If I'm not worthy of military service based on my own actions and capabilities, then his heroism doesn't change that. Commander Mitchell returned to her desk and picked up a pen, making notes in what appeared to be a personal journal rather than an official military document. Santos, I want you to tell me about your brother. Help me understand who he was and what his service meant to your family. For the next hour, Maria found herself sharing stories and memories that she had kept private since beginning her military training. She told Commander Mitchell about Danny's decision to enlist immediately after high school, despite having been accepted to several colleges with academic scholarships. She described his letters home during his first deployment, filled with descriptions of the Afghan children he was helping to protect, and the schools that were being built in areas that had been controlled by hostile forces. She talked about Danny's leave time between deployments, when he had spent every possible moment with family and friends, as if he somehow knew that time was precious and limited. She described his passion for baseball and music, his dream of becoming a teacher after his military service, and his commitment to helping younger kids in their neighborhood stay out of gangs and focus on education. Most importantly, she told Commander Mitchell about the conversation she had had with Danny the night before his second deployment, when he had talked about the importance of service and sacrifice, about the responsibility that comes with being born in a country where freedom and opportunity are protected by the courage of ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. Danny told me that military service isn't about seeking glory or proving toughness, Maria explained. He said it's about being part of something larger than yourself, about protecting the people and values that make life worth living. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find my own way to serve, to carry on the legacy of our family's commitment to this country. Commander Mitchell listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but never breaking eye contact or showing any sign of impatience with the personal nature of Maria's story. When Maria finished speaking, the commander was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing everything she had heard. Santos, the tattoo on your arm. Describe it for me in detail. Maria rolled up her sleeve to reveal the intricate design that had caused so much controversy during her bootcamp training. The bottom section shows the baseball diamond where Danny played Little League, with his uniform number and the date of his first home run. The middle section has a guitar and musical notes representing the song he wrote for our grandmother before she died. The top section shows the mountains visible from our childhood home, with eagles flying overhead. She pointed to different areas of the design as she continued her explanation. The text includes his name, his dates of service, and the Bible verse that was read at his funeral. And this, she indicated a small section near her wrist, is the Purple Heart Medal he was awarded posthumously. Commander Mitchell examined the tattoo carefully, and Maria could see her taking note of details that clearly held significance beyond their artistic merit. The quality of the artwork was exceptional, but more importantly, every element had obvious personal meaning and connection to a life that had been lived with honor and lost in service to others. Santos, this isn't just a tattoo. This is a masterpiece of memorial art that tells the story of a young man's life and sacrifice. The level of detail and personal meaning involved represents the kind of tribute that families create when they want to ensure that heroism is never forgotten. Mitchell paused and looked directly into Maria's eyes. I've seen a lot of tattoos during my military career, including many that were poor decisions made for questionable reasons. But I've also seen memorial tattoos like yours, and I can tell you that they represent some of the deepest expressions of love and respect that I've ever encountered. The commander returned to her desk and began writing what appeared to be an official memorandum. Santos, I'm going to be recommending some significant changes to your training status and future military assignments. But before I do that, I want to ask you one more question. Given everything you've experienced during the past 6 weeks, given the way you've been treated and the assumptions that have been made about your character, do you still want to pursue military service? Maria didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am. More than ever. Danny believed that military service was about overcoming obstacles and proving yourself through actions rather than words. The challenges I've faced during boot camp have only strengthened my resolve to honor his memory through my own service. Commander Mitchell smiled for the first time during their conversation. In that case, Santos, I think it's time for some other people to learn the real story behind that tattoo. And I think it's time for the leadership of this training facility to understand that they've been witnessing character and dedication rather than attitude problems. The call that summoned drill instructor Peterson to Commander Mitchell's office came at 1,400 hours on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the emergency response that had showcased Maria Santos's exceptional medical capabilities. Peterson had been expecting this meeting since learning about Santos's performance during the highway accident, but he had assumed it would be a routine debriefing about recruit capabilities during emergency situations. Instead, he found himself facing a senior medical officer whose expression carried the kind of serious authority that suggested this conversation would be significantly more important than a standard administrative review. Petty Officer Peterson, Commander Mitchell began, using Peterson's formal rank rather than his drill instructor title. I want to discuss Recruit Santos and the evaluation process that led to her current disciplinary status. Peterson straightened in his chair and prepared to defend his assessment of Santos as a recruit with attitude problems and poor judgment. He had spent weeks documenting what he considered to be clear evidence of her unsuitability for military service, and he was confident that his evaluation would be supported by established military standards and protocols. Yes, ma'am. Santos has shown consistent problems with respect for authority and adherence to military standards. Her attitude and appearance indicate someone who prioritizes personal expression over military discipline. Commander Mitchell opened a thick file on her desk and began reading from what appeared to be detailed performance evaluations and incident reports. According to your documentation, Santos has met or exceeded every physical fitness standard, scored above average on all written examinations, demonstrated flawless performance during practical skills testing, and shown exemplary behavior during all training exercises. Peterson shifted uncomfortably as the commander continued reading from his own reports. Your documentation also indicates that she has never failed to follow a direct order, has never been late for any formation or training session, and has maintained her equipment and living space according to the highest military standards. That's correct, ma'am, but her attitude and appearance suggest underlying problems that could manifest under stress. Mitchell looked up from the file with an expression that suggested she found Peterson's reasoning inadequate. Petty Officer, 3 nights ago, Recruit Santos performed advanced medical procedures that saved 3 lives during a mass casualty emergency. She demonstrated clinical skills that impressed experienced Navy medical personnel, showed leadership capabilities under extreme pressure, and exhibited the kind of calm professionalism that we expect from senior medical officers. The commander closed the file and leaned forward slightly. Help me understand how someone with Santos's demonstrated capabilities and performance record could be considered a disciplinary problem based on attitude issues related to her appearance. Peterson felt the conversation shifting in directions he hadn't anticipated, but he remained committed to his assessment of Santos as unsuitable for military service. Ma'am, her tattoo demonstrates poor judgment and lack of respect for military traditions. It suggests someone who prioritizes personal expression over military standards. Describe the tattoo for me, petty officer. Tell me what you see when you look at Recruit Santos's arm. The request caught Peterson off guard, but he responded with the same dismissive description he had used during weeks of public criticism. It's colorful, elaborate, and clearly represents someone who thinks military service is compatible with personal artistic expression. It shows poor decision-making and lack of understanding about military professionalism. Commander Mitchell was quiet for several moments, apparently processing Peterson's response against information that wasn't available to him. Petty Officer Peterson, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because it's going to change your understanding of Recruit Santos and her character. The serious tone in Mitchell's voice immediately got Peterson's attention. As a drill instructor with 15 years of military experience, he had learned to recognize when senior officers were about to share information that would significantly alter his perspective on important matters. The tattoo on Santos's arm is a memorial to her younger brother, Marine Lance Corporal Daniel Santos, who was killed by an improvised explosive device during his second deployment to Afghanistan 3 years ago. He was 19 years old and died while protecting Afghan civilians during a school construction project. Peterson felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of this information began to register. For 6 weeks, he had been publicly criticizing and humiliating a recruit whose tattoo honored a fallen Marine, a young man who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to his country. The design includes imagery from Lance Corporal Santos's childhood, symbols representing his love of baseball, and music, text including his favorite Bible verse, and a representation of the Purple Heart Medal he was awarded posthumously. Commander Mitchell's voice remained steady and professional, but Peterson could hear an underlying tone of disappointment that made him feel increasingly uncomfortable. Recruit Santos enlisted to honor a promise she made to her brother before his final deployment, a promise to follow his example of service to our country. She specifically chose not to use her brother's service record or sacrifice to influence her own military evaluation, because she believed that military service should be earned based on individual merit rather than family connections. Peterson sat in stunned silence as the full weight of his error began to settle over him. He had spent weeks using a memorial to a fallen hero as evidence of poor character and unsuitability for military service. Worse, he had done so publicly, humiliating someone whose only crime had been honoring a family member who died defending the values and freedoms that Peterson himself had sworn to protect. Ma'am, Peterson began, his voice barely above a whisper, I had no idea about her brother's service or the meaning of her tattoo. She never mentioned any of this during our interactions. That's correct, petty officer. Despite weeks of criticism and disciplinary action based on assumptions about her character, Recruit Santos never used her brother's sacrifice to defend herself. She maintained that military service should be judged on performance and capability, not on personal tragedy or family connections. Commander Mitchell stood up and walked to a wall covered with military commendations and photographs from various deployments. Petty Officer Peterson, in 22 years of military service, I've seen many examples of honor, courage, and selfless sacrifice. But I've rarely seen someone endure the kind of systematic humiliation that Santos has experienced while maintaining such dignity and commitment to military values. The commander turned back to face Peterson, her expression showing a mixture of disappointment and determination. What Santos has shown us over the past 6 weeks isn't attitude problems or disrespect for authority. She's shown us character, resilience, and the kind of quiet strength that makes exceptional military leaders. Peterson struggled to find words that could adequately express his recognition of the magnitude of his mistake. Ma'am, I owe Santos a sincere apology and an acknowledgement of my error in judgment. I completely misunderstood the situation and treated her unfairly based on superficial assumptions. An apology will be a good start, petty officer, but this situation requires more than individual recognition of error. Santos's experience here raises serious questions about how we evaluate recruits and what assumptions we make about character based on appearance. Commander Mitchell returned to her desk and picked up what appeared to be a formal military document. I'm recommending that Santos be immediately removed from disciplinary status and transferred to advanced medical training track. Her civilian qualifications and demonstrated capabilities during the recent emergency response indicate that she has the potential to become an exceptional Navy medical professional. She paused and looked directly at Peterson. I'm also recommending a comprehensive review of recruit evaluation procedures, with particular attention to ensuring that we judge military potential based on performance, character, and commitment rather than on superficial assumptions about appearance or personal choices. Yes, ma'am. I fully support both recommendations and accept full responsibility for my failure to properly evaluate Santos's character and potential. Commander Mitchell's expression softened slightly, suggesting that she appreciated Peterson's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes. Petty officer, I want you to understand that this isn't just about one recruit or one evaluation error. This is about our responsibility as military leaders to recognize excellence wherever we find it, and to ensure that our prejudices don't prevent us from identifying and developing the best possible military professionals. The door to Commander Mitchell's office opened, and Colonel James Harrison, the SEAL commander responsible for advanced special operations training, entered the room. Harrison was a legend within the military community, a man whose career included some of the most dangerous and classified missions in recent military history. His presence immediately commanded attention from both Mitchell and Peterson. "Commander Mitchell," Harrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that characterized senior special operations officers, "I understand you wanted me to meet with you about a recruit who performed exceptionally during the recent emergency response." "Yes, sir." "Colonel Harrison, I'd like you to meet Petty Officer Peterson, who has been serving as drill instructor for Recruit Santos. We've been discussing her performance and potential for advanced military service." Harrison nodded to Peterson before turning his attention to Commander Mitchell. "I've reviewed the medical response reports from the highway accident, and I'm impressed by what I read. Emergency surgical airway procedures and needle thoracostomy performed flawlessly under field conditions by a bootcamp recruit represents exceptional capability." The SEAL commander consulted a folder he was carrying. "I've also reviewed Santos's complete military and civilian records. Paramedic certification, urban emergency medical experience, top-tier academic performance, and exemplary physical fitness scores. This is exactly the kind of background we look for in candidates for special operations medical training." Peterson felt another wave of recognition regarding the magnitude of his misjudgment. Not only had he failed to recognize Santos's exceptional qualifications, but those qualifications were apparently significant enough to attract the attention of Special Operations Command. "Colonel," Commander Mitchell said, "there's something else you need to know about Santos before you consider her for advanced training. Something that speaks directly to her character and commitment to military values." Mitchell proceeded to share the story of Maria's tattoo and her brother's service and sacrifice, explaining how she had endured weeks of criticism and disciplinary action without ever using her family's military legacy to defend herself. As the story unfolded, Harrison's expression showed growing respect and interest. She maintained military discipline and standards despite systematic humiliation based on a memorial to a fallen Marine. Harrison asked, his tone suggesting that such behavior impressed him significantly. "That's correct, sir. She believed that military service should be earned based on individual merit, not family connections or sympathy for personal loss." Colonel Harrison was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the full scope of what he had learned about Maria Santos. "Commander Mitchell, I'd like to meet with Santos personally. Based on what you've told me, she may be exactly the kind of person we need for our most demanding training programs. Within the hour, Maria found herself reporting to Commander Mitchell's office, where she was introduced to Colonel Harrison. The presence of a SEAL commander was intimidating enough, but when she learned that he wanted to discuss her potential for special operations medical training, she felt overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her military fortunes. Santos, Colonel Harrison began, I've heard about your performance during the recent emergency response, and I've learned about the personal history behind your tattoo. I want you to know that the kind of character and capability you've demonstrated represents exactly what we look for in special operations medical personnel. The conversation that followed was unlike any military discussion Maria had experienced during her boot camp training. Instead of criticism and assumption, she found herself being evaluated based on her actual qualifications, experience, and demonstrated performance. Colonel Harrison asked detailed questions about her medical training, her emergency response experience, and her long-term career goals within military service. But the moment that would remain etched in Maria's memory forever came when Colonel Harrison stood up, moved to a position directly in front of her, and slowly raised his right hand in a formal military salute. Santos, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military experience and countless dangerous missions. I want you to know that I'm not saluting the recruit who has been struggling with disciplinary issues. I'm saluting the sister of Marine Lance Corporal Daniel Santos, who died serving his country with honor. I'm saluting a young woman who has honored her brother's memory through her own commitment to service, even when that service required enduring unfair treatment with dignity and grace. The salute continued for several more seconds, and Maria felt tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes as she realized that this moment represented everything her brother had believed about military service, honor, and the recognition of true character. I'm also saluting a future Navy medical officer whose skills and dedication will undoubtedly save lives and serve this country with distinction. Santos, it would be my privilege to recommend you for advanced special operations medical training, where your capabilities will be fully utilized and your commitment to excellence will be properly recognized. As Maria returned Colonel Harrison's salute, she thought about Danny and the promise she had made to him before his final deployment. She thought about the weeks of humiliation and doubt that had tested her resolve, but ultimately strengthened her commitment to military service. And she thought about the power of truth, perseverance, and the recognition that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that look like defeats until the full story is finally told. The tattoo on her arm had indeed made a SEAL commander salute, not because of its artistic merit or personal meaning, but because of the character, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to service that it represented. In the end, the hidden ink had revealed not just the story of one young man's heroism, but also the story of his sister's determination to honor his memory through her own dedication to serving something larger than herself.